Welcome to the Tertulia with Carolyn MacDonald on Virgil and the Collapse of the Roman Republic, presented by Tertulius Fredericton in partnership with the MB Media Co-op on May 27th, 2020.
Thanks everybody for being here tonight. Welcome to the Tertulia. Tonight's topic is Virgil and the Collapse of the Roman Republic. Before we get started, just wanted to start by acknowledging that many of us are joining tonight from Wolastoqey territory, that's unceded territory, and the way that this territory has been occupied and used over the last 250 or so years has really had a major impact on different people's ability to gain access to some of the ideas that we are going to talk about tonight. Carolyn MacDonald is presenting in the Tertulia. Dr. MacDonald is a classics professor, assistant professor at UMB. She's the co-editor of City of Plunder, Roman Cargo Culture and the Dynamics of Appropriation with Cambridge University Press. We're really excited about this talk tonight, and she's going to tell us also how this fits into Tertulias in the time of coronavirus. And without further ado, Carolyn, I'll turn it over to you. Thanks very much for joining us.
Great, well, thank you. Hello out there, everyone. Thanks to Matthew, Tracy, and Christy for inviting me to join you for this evening's Tertulia in the time of coronavirus. A few weeks ago, my colleague in the UNB Classics Department, Matthew Sears, spoke to some of you about the ancient plagues and made some fascinating connections between ancient and modern experiences of pandemic illnesses and their social impact. Tonight, I'm going to speak about a different kind of upheaval in the ancient world, but one which I think will offer us just as much to think about as we live through this current crisis. Specifically, as Matthew said, I'll be looking at the collapse of the Roman Republic, when a century of civil violence and political chaos finally gave way to peace and stability, but at a price. As the Romans themselves came to understand it, they secured their peace by relinquishing their republican liberty. Now, as lockdown protests have sprung up in the United States and even here in Canada, I've been fascinated to see this same rhetoric applied to the COVID crisis. And I have some images that I think are relevant to that. So I'm going to attempt a screen share. Ooh. Here we go. So as you can see from the signs that these people are holding in the minds of these protesters, the coronavirus crisis has presented us with that same stark choice that the Romans faced as their republic collapsed, right? This idea that we have to choose between freedom or safety. Now, the American revolutionary Patrick Henry may have coined the phrase liberty or death, which has now become give me liberty or give me coronavirus, but the sentiment goes back at least as far as the fall of the Roman Republic. And in the past, when I've read or taught or talked about the end of the Republic and the subsequent rise of the Roman emperors, it's always been framed as a cautionary tale of how a republican or a democratic state might crumble and an autocracy take root. And there has been no shortage of op-eds and think pieces by classicists like myself comparing Trump's government and the rise of populist governments around the world to the final days of the Roman Republic. And that is, I think, a perfectly valid approach. But watching these COVID protests with their rhetoric of liberty or death has made me think about a different version of the fall of the Roman Republic, which I kind of want to test out with all of you tonight. If you've been following the full story of these protests, you'll be aware that connections have been found to right-wing funding and even white supremacist groups in the US, which raises very serious questions about whose liberty and what kind of liberty is being defended and whose lives are being put at risk to hold on to that liberty. And these are questions worth asking of the fight for the Roman Republic too. At the same time, coming more from the left, there is a growing sense that we cannot and should not return to our old normal with all of its systemic inequities, and that this crisis might actually be an opportunity for positive change. And here too, I think I see a potential parallel to the collapse of the Roman Republic, which really did lead to a permanent transformation of Roman society and politics. Now, what the Romans ended up with was an emperor, which nobody nowadays is advocating for. But that emperor not only secured the peace and stability the Roman people so badly needed, he also instituted reforms that substantially benefited groups that had been marginalized by the far from perfect republican system. So that's why, in a nutshell, I thought that the collapse of the Republic would make for an interesting Tertulia in the time of coronavirus. What I'd like to do is to start by talking about the Roman crisis, its root causes, and the new normal established by the first emperor Augustus Caesar, and then change tack to focus on the life and writings of a poet named Virgil, the big thinker for tonight, who lived through the crisis and the transformation of the Roman state and became a strange kind of poet laureate for the new autocracy. Virgil has been accused for literally millennia of simply pandering to the new emperor and his regime, but his poetry actually performs a remarkable tightrope walk, praising the new peace while mourning the losses that brought it about. And I think that makes him a really compelling author and a compelling thinker for the crisis that we're living in now. So that's the plan. I'll dive right in now with the Roman Republic, the root causes of its collapse, and the century of civil violence that finally brought it crashing down. The first and most important thing to know is that the Roman Republic was not a democracy by ancient or by modern standards. The Romans had what they themselves called a mixed constitution, combining a monarchical element, an aristocratic element, and a democratic element. So each year, the free male-only citizens of Rome elected 2 consuls who were like kings for the year. The consuls and other elected magistrates had the power to convene the citizen assemblies, and those are the democratic element of the Roman constitution. And the assemblies could vote yes or no on proposed legislation, but they couldn't debate it. In all of this, the consuls and the people were supposed to be guided by the Senate, an aristocratic advisory body made up of men who had held important government posts and who for much of Rome's history came from important noble families. So this mixed constitution, rather than the, say, radical participatory democracy of ancient Athens, was the actual model for many modern states, and some Romans were pretty pleased with it. Marcus Tullius Cicero, whom you may have heard about from my colleague Mark Tamellini some months ago, once boasted that such a constitution, a mixed constitution, has in the first place a widespread element of equality, which free men cannot long do without. Second, it has stability. For although monarchies, aristocracies, and democracies easily degenerate into their corrupt versions, such things rarely happen in a political structure which represents a combination and a judicious mixture. The terrible irony in Cicero's boast is that he wrote those words when the Republic was in fact on the brink of collapse. And tragically, he would lose his own life in the civil wars that were dawning. And the truth is that the Romans' republican system did not really have a widespread element of equality. It was very much rigged in favor of wealthy noble families. So for much of Rome's history, the most important government positions were reserved for so-called patricians, that is to say, men who were born into the city's traditional aristocratic families. Other government posts came with property qualifications, so only men with a certain level of wealth were eligible to run for them. And finally, the voting system itself, through which the Romans elected their magistrates and voted yes or no on legislation, prioritized the wealthy. I mean, we say that, rich people's votes count for more, that rich people have a disproportionate impact on our political system today, but it was literally, explicitly, blatantly true in Rome. The wealthy people got to vote first, and their votes counted for more. Unsurprisingly, the non-aristocratic, poorer members of the citizen body, known as the plebeians, were not overly thrilled with this arrangement. And so for centuries, Roman domestic politics consisted of an ongoing struggle between the patricians, who originally held all the power, and the lower class plebeians, who were seeking more influence and more protections against abuses by the patricians. As a result, by the 3rd century BCE, the plebeians had won some key concessions, like the right to stand for the highest offices, provided they had enough money, hold their own assemblies, and even pass laws that were binding on the entire state. But tensions between the elite and the masses persisted and very much contributed to the eventual outbreak of civil war and violence. Now, that is not how the Romans themselves understood the problem. According to a whole host of ancient historians and authors, the Romans were undone not by fundamental weaknesses in their republican system, but by their own military prowess, which had won them a Mediterranean empire stretching from modern-day Spain to Greece. In 146 BCE, the Romans defeated 2 of their greatest rivals in the Mediterranean, the Carthaginians, based in North Africa, and the Greeks. To the Roman way of thinking, this led to 2 major problems. First, it made the Romans rich, and this novel experience of luxury corrupted their once hardy, rustic national character and made them decadent, greedy, and self-indulgent. The second major problem with all of this successful conquering was that it left them without external enemies. And after a solid 400 years of nonstop warfare, the Roman military spirit simply could not be put to rest. And so, as the poet Lucan memorably put it, a mighty people attacked its own entrails with victorious sword hand. Now, in fact, conquering and then attempting to administer a large empire did put significant strain on the Roman republican system, which, after all, had been devised to govern a city and its agricultural hinterland, not a powerful empire. The high rate of turnover in the government, imagine, for example, if we elected 2 new prime ministers every year, it made political amateurism a real problem. And on top of that, the generals and governors sent out to conquer and then rule the conquered territories often enriched themselves and their own soldiers in the process, which generated tension at home and abroad. The Roman conquest also created a huge population of enslaved peoples, many of whom ended up working on the massive aristocratic farming estates that came to dominate the Italian countryside. These estates were technically illegal because they spilled over onto huge swaths of public land that was supposed to be used by smallholders. But the law restricting use of public land was conveniently ignored by the aristocratic senators, who were the ones breaking the law in the first place. As these estates grew, profiting from the free labor of the enslaved, they enriched their already wealthy owners, while simultaneously forcing small-time farmers off their land and into lives of poverty in the city. And this in turn fed the flames of urban unrest. So to sum up, by the latter half of the 2nd century BCE, the Roman Republic was beginning to stagger under its own weight. The Italian countryside was dominated by massive aristocratic estates worked by enslaved people. The city, as a result, was plagued by urban poverty and unrest. The Republican system concentrated power in the hands of wealthy aristocrats who might spend their lives in government but only hold a given post for a single year. The Romans had conquered more territory than they could competently administer, and the generals carrying out the conquest were growing rich off the spoils and using their money to buy the personal loyalty of their soldiers, who came to function as private armies. This toxic brew finally bubbled over into a century of civil unrest and outright violence, beginning in 133 BCE and continuing until 30 BCE, when Augustus, the man who would become the first emperor of Rome, defeated Mark Antony and Cleopatra in the last of 6 civil wars. Now, I am not going to go through all of these conflicts in any kind of detail because then we would be here for months, but I do want to show you just a quick timeline of them so you have a sense of the enormity of the problem. So I'm just going to do a little screen share again here. So here we have 100 years of civil violence, largely pitting populist politicians who are in red in this timeline against conservative, i.e. sort of aristocratic noblemen in the Senate. So in 133 to 123, we have the Agrarian Crisis, which I will talk about in a little bit more detail. 88 to 81, there's the first out-and-out civil war between Marius and Sulla. 63, the Catalinarian conspiracy. 49 to 45, another civil war, which many of you will know about already. This is the clash between Julius Caesar and Pompey, immediately followed by another civil war, 44 to 42, between Octavian, the man who would become Augustus, and Antony against Caesar's assassinators. Hard on the heels of that, and finally bringing the century to its end, one last civil war between Octavian and Antony and Cleopatra. So as we saw in that quick slide, more or less each time the violence flared up, it pitted a new breed of populist politicians who sought the support of the urban masses against the conservative aristocrats in the Senate. And both sides throughout this century of crisis were guilty of making end runs against the checks and balances of the Republican system. So for example, to go back to that first crisis, the Agrarian Crisis that began in 133, when the populist reformer Tiberius Gracchus wanted to pass a law that would redistribute public land to the poor and homeless in Rome, he had to sidestep consulting the conservative Senate because they almost certainly would have shot the law down. And instead, he took his bill directly to the plebeian assembly. He then forcibly removed from the assembly a fellow magistrate who had the intention and the right to veto his law. So he was playing fast and loose with what the Republican system allowed. The Senate then retaliated when the law passed by underfunding Gracchus's land redistribution project and threatening to prosecute him. Finally, when Gracchus stood for re-election a year later, a mob of those same conservative senators descended on the electoral assembly and assassinated Tiberius and some 300 of his supporters. Apparently, they broke up the benches that the electors were sitting on and turned them into ready-made clubs and staves and just beat Tiberius Gracchus and his supporters to death in the very place where the Romans had gathered to elect their leaders for the year. Other examples of civil violence and of end runs around the checks and balances of the Republican system are less grisly, but no less indicative of a breakdown in this Republican system. During Julius Caesar's first term as consul, for example, in 59 BCE, his conservative colleague Marcus Bibulus attempted to prevent the passage of a bill, again a land redistribution bill, that would purchase and distribute farmland to veteran soldiers returning from the East. Conservative senators walked out of the Senate meeting and refused to hear the bill. So like Tiberius Gracchus before him, Caesar took it directly to one of the citizen assemblies. Bibulus then showed up to denounce the bill to the people, and he was roundly humiliated by Caesar's supporters in the crowd, who threw him to the ground and apparently poured a basket of human excrement all over him. After that, Bibulus spent the remainder of his consulship at home, he didn't leave his house for the rest of the year, claiming that he was watching the skies for omens. And because Roman political business could only technically be conducted once favorable omens had been spotted, Bibulus's actions rendered all of the laws that Caesar passed that year invalid. There were also, as we saw in that slide a minute ago, a series of out-and-out wars waged between populist and conservative generals come politicians, backed by their private armies, which brought devastation to the Italian countryside. The warring generals even marched on Rome itself. Julius Caesar was not the first to do that. And then they made themselves dictators and often put to death thousands of their rivals and opponents. Now, at the end of this century of violence, one man emerged who managed to seize and hold on to power, Octavian, later known as Augustus Caesar, who we now think of as the first emperor of Rome. But because Augustus survived and thrived in this new role, he is not the one demonized in Latin literature as the great tyrant who destroyed liberty. That dubious honor goes to his great uncle and adopted father, Julius Caesar. After waging a war of conquest in Gaul and Germania, so modern-day France and Germany roughly, Caesar became embroiled in a civil war with the conservative senators, and his opponents were subsequently glorified as heroes of the Republic who died in the name of liberty. And that's the way that they are remembered and referred to, for example, by the American founding fathers, and how this credo of liberty or death works its way from the end of the Roman Republic into American revolutionary discourse and now into the coronavirus discourse. But we should not forget, I want to suggest tonight, that these Republican heroes had also driven Rome towards civil war by antagonizing and blocking populist politicians. And the liberty they fought for, as we've seen, was not an equal sharing of rights and freedoms for the greater good of all the citizens of Rome. At any rate, Julius Caesar and Augustus, in fact, had remarkably similar careers. Both men fought and won civil wars against their fellow Romans, and both men went on to hold unconstitutional supreme power in Rome. However, whereas Julius Caesar was assassinated 5 years after seizing power, Augustus ruled for 41 years, permanently transformed the Roman state, and died in his bed. One reason for Augustus's success, undoubtedly, was his superior PR. Whereas Caesar adopted the title of Dictator Perpetuus, dictator for life, not a popular choice, Augustus made a great show of restoring and working within Republican institutions. So in the chaos that followed Julius Caesar's assassination, which was not at all popular with the masses, who in fact were very fond of Caesar, Augustus and 2 other men were officially granted extra constitutional powers and tasked with rebuilding the Republic. And in order to do this, they were given the authority to make laws without consulting the Senate or holding a citizen vote, and they could appoint government officials rather than holding elections. Essentially, Rome had declared a state of emergency and appointed Augustus and his colleagues dictators until the crisis passed. This arrangement, which we now refer to as a triumvirate, was short-lived. Augustus forced one of his colleagues, a man named Lepidus, into exile and famously defeated the other, Mark Antony, in yet another civil war. After this, in 27 BCE, Augustus formally handed back his extra constitutional powers to the Senate and the people of Rome and declared that the Republic had been restored. That was his great slogan, Res Publica Restituta. We have made Rome a republic again. But at the Senate's insistence, of course, he retained the consulship, which he had already held for 4 years running, and he agreed to administer the empire's wealthiest provinces, which meant that he retained control over Rome's grain supply and the significant mineral resources in Spain. 4 years later, in 23 BCE, Augustus resigned the consulship and never held it again, taking up instead the more modest powers of a tribune. But at the same time, the Senate granted him the right to instruct all elected magistrates. So in truth, he retained substantial power. And even this arrangement caused the people to riot, which they did several times over the course of these years, not because they were afraid that the Republic was dying and Augustus was making himself a king, but because they were terrified that a true revival of the Republic would deprive them of their benefactor and lead back to the cycle of personal rivalries and civil war and bloodshed that they had been suffering under for the past 100 years. So in his decade as sole ruler, Augustus had ushered in an age of prosperity, peace, and safety. And the common people of Rome apparently preferred this to the liberty Cato had died for. So much so that they refused for several years to elect more than one consul, and were only placated at last when Augustus began dressing as a consul in public, even though he no longer held the position. They wanted to see him as the supreme authority in the state because he had brought them safety and peace. It's also worth noting, before I move on to Virgil, that the new normal established by Augustus did benefit some members of Roman society who had previously been excluded from power. Under Augustus and the emperors who followed him, elite patricians lost a good deal of their influence, but wealthy commoners, former slaves, and women all gained higher levels of socio-political visibility and importance. So naturally, I am not saying that I hope the COVID crisis will bring about benevolent dictatorships in Canada and around the world, but I do hope that our new normal will better serve the people dispossessed by our current economic and political systems. And I think we should try not to get too distracted from this goal by the people in these protests crying liberty or death, if the liberty they're so desperate to defend is their freedom to profit from the many inequities of our old normal. So I'll turn now to the big thinker in the title of this Tertulia, Publius Vergilius Maro, the Latin poet we now call Virgil. Virgil offers us a fascinating window into the crisis and transformation I've just discussed, because he lived and wrote right in the middle of it. Virgil, as I mentioned at the outset, eventually became a kind of poet laureate for the Augustan regime, and his poetry certainly contributes to the Augustan ideology of peace and prosperity. But it is also full of grief for the losses and sacrifices that brought about the new Golden Age. Now, like almost all the great figures in Latin literature, Virgil was not from Rome itself. He was born in 70 BCE near Mantua in northern Italy to a family of small landholders. So 70 BCE, the year of his birth, was a mere 10 years after the devastating civil war between the generals Marius and Sulla, and the Italian countryside was still very much struggling to recover. Then, when Virgil was 7, a group of disaffected senators and Civil War veterans, led by a man named Cataline, conspired to foment unrest throughout Italy and seize power in Rome through arson and murder. They rallied a large number of plebeians to their cause by promising debt relief for all, which was sorely needed at this point. But the conspiracy was unsuccessful, and its leaders in Rome were put to death controversially without trial. Cataline and his army, stationed in Tuscany at the time, crisscrossed the northern countryside, attempting to flee into Gaul, and were eventually defeated in a battle near Florence. So this is all taking place more or less in Virgil's backyard. When Virgil was 21, civil war erupted again and lasted from 49 to 42 BCE. First, Julius Caesar clashed with Pompey, Cato, and the conservative senators, and then Caesar's heirs Augustus and Antony clashed with Caesar's assassins. Major battles were primarily fought overseas, but Italy was profoundly affected too. In order to reward their soldiers, Augustus and Antony confiscated large amounts of farmland from Italian cities, including Virgil's hometown of Mantua. And according to an ancient biographical tradition, Virgil himself lost his family farm in the land confiscations of 41 BCE, and then somehow got it back, perhaps through the intervention of someone in Augustus's administration. In any case, it is right in the midst of the chaos and misery caused by these confiscations that Virgil began his career as a poet, with a collection of 10 poems poignantly celebrating the pastoral life of shepherds. These early poems, known as the bucolic, actually reflect upon the tragedy of the dispossessed peasants, of the people who were forced off their land by Antony and Augustus. But the poems also hold out hope for peace and prosperity returning to the land. This tension between grief and hope is dramatized in the first poem of the collection, a conversation between two elderly shepherds. Melibœus has been ordered off his land and is departing with his flock, while Tityrus, who many scholars believe is a poetic stand-in for Virgil himself, has been allowed to stay. Melibœus laments the fate of the Italians forced from their land and the civil strife that has brought this to pass. He says at one point in the poem, "We must go hence, some to thirsty Africa, some to reach Scythia and the chalk-rolling Oaxes, and the Britons wholly sundered from the world. Oh, shall I ever, long years hence, look again on my country's borders, on my humble cottage with its turf roof? Shall I ever, long years hence, look amazed on a few ears of corn, once my kingdom? Is a godless soldier to hold these well-tilled fields, a barbarian these crops? See where strife has brought our unhappy citizens. Now, Tityrus, by contrast, over the course of the poem, praises as a god the young man, possibly Augustus himself, who heard his plea and granted him the right to live and pasture his flocks on the land as before. And without any apparent bitterness, Melibœus congratulates him, saying, "Happy old man, so these lands will still be yours and large enough for you." The balance between Tityrus's good fortune and Melibœus's disaster is maintained throughout the poem, never tipping in one direction or another. So the poem is simultaneously a lament for the miseries caused by civil war and land confiscation, and it is a celebration of the peace and abundance that the lucky few may continue to enjoy in the Italian countryside. After the publication of the Bucolics, which apparently brought Virgil to the attention of the sort of culture makers in Rome, he came to enjoy the patronage of a man named Maecenas, a close friend of Augustus, who supported many of the most important poets of the day. With Maecenas' support, Virgil spent the next decade writing his second major poem, the Georgics, which is a didactic poem about farming, which is to say it is full of good advice on how to succeed as a farmer in the Italian countryside. And we never, ever assign it to undergraduates for precisely that reason. But it had some interesting moments in it as well. The publication of the Georgics coincided with Augustus's triumphant return from vanquishing Antony and Cleopatra in Egypt. In fact, there's a legend that that Augustus stopped at Maecenas' villa on his march back to Rome, and Virgil recited for 3 days straight so that Augustus could hear the Georgics before he returned triumphant to the city. And this poem, in light of Augustus's victory, his recent victory, is a more straightforward celebration of life in the Italian countryside. Augustus himself makes cameos throughout as a semi-divine figure who creates the conditions of peace and stability within which the farmer's world can return to its natural rhythms and abundance. This aspect of the Georgics has a profound influence on the development of Augustan ideology and imagery, as we can see from a monument, and this is the last image I want to share with you tonight, dedicated to Augustus in 9 BCE. So these are some shots of the altar of the Augustan peace, the Ara Pacis Augustae, which the Senate built to celebrate Augustus starting in 13 BCE and concluding in 9. The two pictures on the left show you more or less what the building would have looked like as it stood in ancient Rome. It was riotously painted, it was very colorful, and it had these 4 relief panels, 2 on the front and 2 at the back. One of which is sort of like a perfect encapsulation of what Virgil is doing in the Georgics, which is evoking the fertility, the abundance, the peace, and the beauty of the Italian countryside. And that's the image that you see on the left. We're not entirely certain who the goddess in the middle is. She might be Pax, the goddess of peace. She might be Tellus, the goddess of the earth. She might be Italia, the divine personification of Italy herself. But in any case, as you can see, she is a fertile mother cradling twins, and she is surrounded by the good things of the countryside. There's a little piggy at her feet and a bull, and the seasons are joining with her. And then beneath her, and this runs all the way around the monument, is this incredibly lush vegetation of acanthus plants and various other symbolically important vegetation. So this whole altar is about celebrating the return to fertility, the return to abundance that Augustus's reign brings about. And that's something that Virgil very much contributed to, that kind of ideology and this kind of imagery. However, at the same time as it contributed to this vision of a new golden age of peace and fertility and abundance under Augustus, the Georgics has a strange sort of double perspective on the final round of the civil wars, reflecting both the anxiety of the period before Antony's defeat and the relief finally brought about by Augustus's victory. So for example, book 1 begins, it's 4 books long, by the way, should you ever feel like you want to read 4 straight books of advice on farming. Book 1 begins with an invocation of Augustus as a god who watches over a world at peace and brings forth the life of the fields. But the same book, book 1, ends with a lament for the world still turned upside down by civil war, a world in which, as Virgil puts it, fields lie neglected, robbed of farmers, and curved pruning hooks are beaten into solid blades. Now, Virgil was a notoriously painstaking editor of his own poetry. Recall, it took him 10 years to write these 4 books. So this double vision is certainly not an oversight. Rather than removing the sections of the poem written while the civil wars raged on and the people were still plagued by this sense of anxiety, Virgil chose to keep them in. And amidst all the celebration of the countryside and its fertility, Virgil also implies that the wounds to the land and its people persist and will persist long into the future. When he speaks of the Civil War battlefields in particular, which he describes as enriched with Roman blood, he imagines a time in the future when a farmer laboring at the earth with curved plow will come upon spears eaten by scabrous rust, or strike an empty helmet with its heavy hoe and wonder at giant bones in the opened grave. So there's a sense in which the land, which the Georgics is meant to celebrate, has also become the sort of common burial ground. The whole empire and all of its land have become the common burying ground of the Romans who clashed in this terrible civil war. And Virgil leaves us to ponder that. After the publication of the Georgics, moving on in Virgil's career, he began work on his magnum opus, an epic poem about the Trojan prince Aeneas. According to Greek and Italian mythology, dating back to at least the 6th century BCE, Aeneas had escaped the sack of Troy and led a small band of refugees to Italy, where his descendants would one day found the city of Rome. Virgil was still working on the Aeneid when he died in 17 BCE, so the poem as we have it came into being during the first decade of the so-called Augustan Golden Age, when the civil wars finally gave way to peace and prosperity throughout the empire. Now, not coincidentally, Julius Caesar and subsequently Augustus counted themselves among Aeneas's direct Roman descendants. And ancient commentators on Virgil's epic were quick to declare that its purpose was to praise Augustus, beginning with his ancestors. And it is undeniably true, there is no shortage of praise for Augustus in the Aeneid, both implied and explicit. Although the events of the epic actually take place almost a millennium before Virgil and Augustus's own time, the poet contrives to mention Augustus through prophecies delivered at key moments in the poem. So for example, in book 1, the god Jupiter reveals to the goddess Venus, who happens to be Aeneas's mother, that her descendants are destined to hold an empire without end. And he promises her, one day Trojan Caesar will come to circumscribe empire with ocean, fame with heaven's stars. And all tranquil, you will take him heavenward in time, laden with plunder from the east, and he with you will be invoked in prayer. Wars then will end, harsh centuries will soften. And similarly, when Aeneas visits his father Anchises in the underworld, in book 6 of the Aeneid, he looks upon the souls of all the great Romans to be born in the future, including Augustus, and once again, Augustus is praised as the one who will bring a golden age to Italy, peace, prosperity, magnificent empire. But along with all of this praise of Augustus, civil wars get plenty of stage time in the Aeneid as well. For example, in that same section of book 6, when Aeneas and Anchises are surveying the Romans to be, they see Julius Caesar and Pompey, combatants in the civil war of 49 to 45, and Anchises cries out, "Sons, refrain! You must not blind your hearts to that enormity of civil war, turning against your country's very heart her own strength." Just as importantly, Aeneas's entire story is one of personal loss and sacrifice in the name of a city and a people that he will not live to see. His signature virtue is pietas, the Latin word from which our English word piety is derived, but they have quite different meanings. Pietas for the Romans meant a kind of total self-sacrificing devotion to the gods, to one's people, and to one's family. And embodying this pietas over the course of the epic, Aeneas suffers the loss of his beloved wife Creusa, and then is forced by the gods to abandon his new love, the Carthaginian queen Dido, who commits suicide when he abandons her. And when he and his fellow refugees finally arrive in Italy, a hostile divine power stirs up a brutal war between the Trojan newcomers and the local Italian population. A war which Virgil represents as yet another civil war, because the Trojans and Italians are destined to one day live in peace. And so the Aeneid, like the bucolics and the Georgics, maintains this double perspective. The prophetic passages are full of praise for Augustus and the Rome that he is creating, but the epic also reminds us of the immense personal sacrifices and the terrible losses that Rome has always required. And as a result, there's been a lot of controversy over how we ought to interpret this poem. Is it, as the ancient commentators claimed, pro-Augustan propaganda that justifies all that suffering by glancing towards the glory days to come? Or is it anti-Augustan subversion that undermines the Roman Golden Age by foregrounding the misery that brought it about? I don't think Virgil lets us land on one pole or the other, and I encourage you to go all read the Aeneid with the extra time we all have on our hands these days, and then you can weigh in for yourselves. The way I read the text is that Virgil mourns and celebrates simultaneously, and he prompts us to ask ourselves a question that's very relevant, I think, to the current crisis. What can we, should we, or must we sacrifice in the name of peace, safety, and the hope of a golden age to come? So that concludes the remarks that I had prepared. Thank you all so much.
Thank you very much, Carolyn. And that was really super interesting. You know, the idea of a tertulia really is to share ideas about stuff that maybe we're not experts in, but we know somebody who knows more than we do. And this was really a great occasion, basically, to hear about a topic that you know, we hear very superficially about in the school system. So thank you very much.
This video was published by the nbmediacoop.org in New Brunswick, Canada.